Germany is the fourth largest GDP in the world, and is the economic engine of Europe. It's a country, while initially giving lip service to NATO, has very recently sort of jumped in with both feet, pledging major funds to building up their military, sending tanks and equipment to Ukraine. And it's really been a turning point in terms of the whole way that Germany previously regarded becoming involved in conflicts outside. As a result of this, and also they've also changed their views on Nord Stream 2 and their supports with Russia. So this has really been sort of a major turning point in the way that Germany has approached their relationships with not only Russia, but with other countries as well, and a much stronger involvement in NATO. So I guess a number of questions come up, and that is, internally, what does that look like within Germany? And then also a number of other issues that we see. There is with England's departure from the EU, we also see Germany and France as sort of the leaders now of the EU. And that's a relationship that is not always an easy relationship, and yet very, very important, both for the future of Europe, but also for the United States as well. And then another question that always comes up is China. And China is Germany's largest trading partner, and yet the United States also claims it as a major ally. And that's what will be interesting, I think, is for Germany and how they are able to balance that relationship. And it may be that they will be not only able to balance it, but they will also be helpful in keeping that relationship flowing more easily for the US as well. So to give us perspective on all these things and many more, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Liana Fix. She's a fellow for Europe at the Council for Foreign Relations. Sorry, it's early in my day to be talking. She's a historian and political scientist with expertise in German, European, foreign and security policy, European security, transatlantic relations, Russia and Eastern Europe. She's the author of The New German Power, Germany's Role in European Russia Policy. Her work focuses on German domestic and foreign policy, the European Union, transatlantic relations, and Europe's relation with Russia and China. So you can see that we have, in asking her to speak for us, really hit someone who is an expert and very studied in this area. Previously, she was program director for the international affairs at Kober Stiftung in Berlin. She's also a resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., and at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. Her resume is extensive, and rather than I keep reading it, I think we would all like to hear from her, but let me just mention that she has a Master's of Science in Theory and History of International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and her PhD in Political Science from the Justin Liebig University in Gießen. You can understand German is not my first language. So in any case, with that, I would like to welcome, on behalf of our policy group, Liana Fix.
Thank you very much, June. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak about Germany and Germany's evolution, or some would say perhaps revolution, since the outbreak of the war and since Russia's war against Ukraine started. It's great to hear that there's a lot of interest in this role, that there's a lot of interest in the US-German relationship, but also in what role Germany will and can play in the strategic competition of the United States with China. And I will try to address all these questions, but perhaps first I would like to go a little bit back in time to understand better how this kind of change that we've seen in Germany has come about, how it is also related to domestic politics in Germany, and how it has unfolded throughout the last year, before I go back to the challenges that are ahead, both with Russia and also with China. So looking back in the past, probably the most important day to pinpoint the kind of change that we now describe in Germany's foreign and security policy is the 27th of February 2022. So that is 3 days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is a Sunday, and it is a day where the German Bundestag, the German parliament, comes together for a special session where Chancellor Olaf Scholz gives a government statement, a government explanation of his policy about how Germany will react to Russia's attack on Ukraine. So that is very much 3 days after the outbreak and after the start of Russia's invasion, and very much at a moment when both Germany, but also Europe and obviously the United States are still in a state of shock. So there were a lot of reports before that this war can take place. There was a lot of intended intelligence leaking from the United States to convince its European allies that this war is really coming. But still, it was, especially in Berlin, it was a shock that it actually happened. And it required, under this impression of Russia is still attacking Kiev, is still trying to get Kiev under control, it required a strong response. And that also explains the urgency in the speech that Olaf Scholz has given on this day, because it was very much a situation where Germany felt that Russia was under porta. So Russia was at the gates. It was not clear that Ukraine would be able to fight Russia back. But the possibility that Russia could control and occupy almost the entirety of Ukraine was very much real. So against the backdrop of this, Olaf Scholz gave his speech, which he said is a speech against the backdrop of a Zeitenwende, a changing of times. And in the speech, he explained 5 points. He made the point that, first of all, Germany will support Ukraine with weapon deliveries, something that it refused to do so before. It refused to do so since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, arguing back then that there's no military solution to Russia's aggression. So that's a change in one of the main principles of Germany's foreign policy, that there's no military solution. Suddenly it was acknowledged that actually to fight back an aggressor, sometimes you need a military solution and you need weapons, as there's no alternative to proceed otherwise. The second point was that Germany announced it would spend from now on 2% every year for its in its defense budget, which would meet NATO's stated goal that every NATO member state should aim to spend 2%. Germany has missed this goal in the past. It was at around 1.5%, which is still, in terms of GDP, in absolute numbers, it is obviously still something and a major contribution. But it was not only that Germany was missing the 2%, it was also that the German Bundeswehr, for years after the end of the Cold War, has been reduced to a size and stretched to its limits, which really posed the question, is Germany defensible at all? Is Germany's Bundeswehr, Germany's army, in a condition in which it can contribute to the defense of Germany and to the defense of Germany's allies? So the urgency to invest 2% of GDP in defense spending was met with a special fund that was set up, which is, on the one hand, a quick way to find extra money for the defense budget in the German Bundeswehr. It was a 100 billion fund, but at the same time, it was outside of the regular budget. It was actually anchored in the German constitution. So this means that at this point, there was a quick financial support available to put into place some important defense project, for instance, to continue the nuclear sharing in which Germany participates of US nuclear weapons within NATO. But at the same time, this special fund prevented, and the politicians who designed it avoided to make the difficult trade-offs at the time, which means, well, if you have a special fund, you don't need to cut the regular budget to find the money to spend for defense. So these kind of difficult trade-offs, what would you cut in, let's say, social spending in other areas to increase your defense budget, was avoided with a special fund. That was the second point. The third point that Chancellor Olaf Scholz made in the speech, is that Germany needed to reduce its energy dependency on Russia. And that was something which many analysts, especially those working on Russia and Eastern Europe, have said for years, that Germany's dependence on Russian gas, which has reached more than 50%, was just not tenable. And especially the way how Russia has leveraged with lobby contacts in Germany the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, trying to circumvent Ukraine, was something which too long has been accepted by a kind of permissive consensus in the German domestic debate, where no one really questioned the links between lobbyism, between politicians, between Gazprom. And the most prominent example is obviously the former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who then worked for Gazprom and for Rosneft, Russian oil and gas companies, and basically became a lobbyist who shared Russian views. So for Germany, it was incredibly important at a time when Russia was using energy as a weapon to come down from 50% of dependence. And in the past, there was a golden rule which said, never should Germany be more dependent on one supplier for more than 30%. So this rule was entirely ignored, and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was put into place and agreed to actually after the annexation of Crimea, which made it even more difficult to understand how this kind of permissive consensus in politics, in business interests, and in lobbying came about, which allowed basically to have a kind of a myth about the energy relationship with Russia being the bridge, and a politically important bridge towards Russia. The other 2 points that Olaf Scholz mentioned are also equally important points. It is about the contribution to nuclear sharing that I just mentioned, and it is also he also talked about the resilience of Europe's society to be aware of hybrid attacks from Russia, to be aware of disinformation coming out of this war. But really most important from that speech was perhaps the support for Ukraine in weapons and the 2% pledge. So how have these two things developed over the last year? The 2% pledge was easier said than done. Because if you have a special 100 billion budget, you can't spend the money immediately. You need to do contracts, you need to put out what you need, and it will take time. So within 1 year, the pledge to spend 2% every year had to be walked back with a promise to work towards 2%. Which was disappointing because the implementation of this spending 2% was for many too slow. The defense ministry was at the beginning not doing what it was supposed to do in quickly getting out contracts and quickly making sure that the money is spent in a useful way. The other part about support for Ukraine and the weapons deliveries for Ukraine were, from the perspective of many critics, too slow. They were too much of a piecemeal approach, and they were too much guided by escalation concerns. So it really took about a year until Germany agreed that German tanks will be sent to Ukraine, which will be very important now for Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia. But it was really only when the United States agreed to send its own tanks that Germany would also send those tanks. So what comes out as a picture of sort of 1 year of change in Germany is that many of the old central tenets of German foreign policy have been overcome. The military restraint, the culture of believing into the benefits of change through trade. This idea that Russia can only be a partner for Germany based on the kind of historical reconciliation of the past. So many of these things were overcome, but at the same time, Germany has not moved into the kind of decisive leadership role that many have hoped for Germany at that time. And that is something which probably is still very much the case. We see Germany changing, but we see a lack of urgency and we see a lack of leadership efforts in this change. What does this mean overall for the US-German relationship, but also for joint policy towards China? That's probably the question which is most important to those who follow the Germany debate. in DC, but also in other capitals of the world. Because the big question today really is, to what extent is China different or similar to Russia? And to what extent do we have to prepare and to embrace for a similar surprise that we've seen in Russia, that we might have overlooked the signs of a country that is increasingly hostile, that is increasingly aggressive in its foreign policy and linked to an increasing autocratization at home. So can China become the next Russia case? And there we see that in Germany and Europe, after the shock of Russia's invasion, there was certainly thinking that, oh, what would that mean for China? The dependence with China is certainly much bigger than the dependence on Russia. So the dependence on Russia was only, sort of the majority of that dependence was only on fossil fuels, whereas with China, it really spans different industries. China is Germany's most important trading partner. Russia was only, never even got under the top 10 of Germany's most important trading partners. So the China challenge is much bigger for Germany. And what we see now is that after 1 year of war, there's a little bit of hope that, saying China is not Russia will be enough to kind of handle the risks. And the risks for Germany's economy are twofold. The first risk is that we have a couple of very big companies in Germany, BASF, Volkswagen, and so on, which are very dependent on the Chinese market. So if the Chinese market comes under question due to political differences or concerns, those companies are too big to fail because they're so important for the German economy. But what we see right now is that these companies are actually doubling down their investment in China. Instead of pursuing what the EU Commission President von der Leyen has called a de-risking strategy. So making sure that you are not too dependent on your profits and on your general well-being of your company on China. And these companies, we also have the small and medium-sized companies, which Germany is very famed for. And the small and medium-sized companies are actually more cautious towards China. And they know that China, the market in China is a difficult market. They had problems in the past with IP theft, and they are sort of more aware of the downsides because they have not been cushioned by the kind of political support that the big companies received. So from an economic perspective for Germany, it will be crucial to make sure that any kind of tensions with China will not lead to a major risk for the German economy. And that doesn't mean decoupling. I think that this has become a really famous word, that the West and the United States wants to decouple from China. I don't think that is the case, but it really means to reduce the risks of exposure. And if we remember that it was Xi Jinping who said that he wants the world to become more dependent on China, but he wants China to become less dependent on the world, it is very clear where this is headed. And one of the challenges that Germany's companies have now, especially the automotive companies, are, for example, that the Chinese market for electric vehicles is quickly overtaken by Chinese producers, something which German companies have waited for too long and have not met the demands of the Chinese companies. So what sort of emerges from what I've just said is a clear picture that Germany can play a role when it comes in the kind of strategic competition with China in the economic sphere. What is more difficult is to expect a German role in the Indo-Pacific in the security area. That is different from Germany's, that is different when it comes to Germany, France, and the UK. France and the UK, for instance, had a much longer tradition of military power. France has, despite the much criticized comments from President Macron when he was returning from Beijing, France is actually sending its own warships through the Taiwan Strait. So it has a security posture. It is there with its own military, which Germany doesn't have. And if that's the case, it is all the more important that what would really help US foreign policy and what would be important for US foreign policy is to have Germany as someone who can take care of security in Europe. And that will be a long process. But if Germany continues the path that it is on, Germany can contribute as a security provider, a security guarantor in Europe, which in the long term can decrease the burden that the US has of being engaged in the Indo-Pacific and also in Europe. So what we can expect from Germany is really playing a role in Europe in the security sphere, making further strides in the implementation of its agenda, and then sort of reducing the burden for the US engagement in Europe and Asia. And one last point that I want to make before I conclude is that an important aspect of everything that I've laid out is the domestic debate in Germany. And what is interesting is that we just had a new German coalition in power. So the end of the Merkel era, which certainly played into Putin's calculus, thinking, well, if Angela Merkel is leaving the stage, that's certainly a good opportunity, or makes it perhaps easier to come through with this aggressive invasion of Ukraine. But what we have now in the German political landscape is something entirely new. We have a three-party coalition of social democrats, of Greens, and of liberals. And in the past, Germany was able to be governed by two-party coalitions. That is over because the party political landscape has changed, it has broadened, and the big tent parties have actually become smaller. So it's the first time that we have a three-party coalition in government. And it's interesting that it is a coalition with the Greens, which traditionally in their history have pacifist roots, with the Social Democrats, which traditionally in their history have been quite Russia-friendly, and with the liberals, who traditionally have been very business-friendly. So this coalition of traditionally pacifist, Russia-friendly, and business-friendly parties had to come up with a response to Russia's invasion, which was exactly the opposite. It was about military defense, it was about sanctions, and it was about confronting Russia. And that's perhaps one of the signs of hope that we can have, that it is an unusual coalition that is taking these steps, but exactly because it is an unusual coalition, it contributes to a broader domestic consensus in Germany, because the opposition party, the Christian Democratic Union, has been stronger on security policy in the past already. So it will be more difficult, let's say, that in the next elections, this coalition goes into the opposition. It will be more difficult for them to oppose these big changes that have been made, because of the changes that they themselves have put into place. And that suggests that we might have a longer term consensus in Germany on these changes from military restraint to military power in Germany. It's not an entirely rosy picture. There are problems within the government coalition. So for instance, a national security strategy, the first national security strategy that Germany was meant to have, was postponed because of disagreements between the foreign ministry, which is governed by the Green Party, and the chancellery, which is governed by the Social Democrats. There is a constant power struggle between these three different parties, a constant struggle about how forcefully to confront Russia and China, how sort of value-driven should German foreign policy be. And these struggles have, at least at the moment, slowed down this process of making national security more structured in Germany, with the National Security Council, with the National Security Strategy. So that is something which is unfortunate, and some of the magic of what sort of the coalition at the beginning tried to evoke, saying, well, this is a new coalition for new times in Germany, is certainly gone. But then it is certainly quite a tough year, and a big challenge that they've mastered, especially sort of bringing Germany back from the brink of not being able to supply energy to its citizens and to its industry, given to the huge drop in supply from Russia and the sudden need to buy new energy at moon prices at the time. So especially the last winter, and this winter will be easier. The last winter was really a challenge in this regard. So it was very much, the coalition was very much confronted with existential questions that it had to face. And these existential questions it had been able to master, but that obviously doesn't leave a lot of space for, the magic, for the glitter in the coalition that you would want to have. It's certainly easier to rule in calm times than it is to rule in times of war, of the return of war in Europe, where you have to not only convince your own party bases that the times have changed, but to convince the entire electorate in Germany, which is also divided between an electorate in West Germany and East Germany with very different views, and East German citizens in Germany being much more careful and partly also much more reluctant to have a policy of containing Russia, to have a policy of supporting Ukraine than its West German counterpart. So even these divides, which seem to be really a long time ago, are still reflected in the current policies. I think I would leave it here for the moment, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry.
I have a
Joined in.
question.
Yep,
I have a
go ahead.
question on domestic energy policy in Germany. You cited the fact that Germany and the EU handled the last winter surprisingly well in terms of having been cut off from Russian supplies, and the dire predictions for the lights out scenario didn't actually happen. But I think most people were surprised to see that your last nuclear plant was just recently decommissioned, so that you are basically sweeping aside the potential for a nuclear contribution to your total energy picture. And I'm wondering how that is viewed internally. Is that reflecting maybe an overemphasis on green sympathies, or how does that stand politically? Is that widely accepted that nuclear is not going to be a factor going forward, and that renewables will have to take up the slack, I guess?
I think that's a very good question, and it's actually a little bit of a counterintuitive and a complicated picture. But let me start first by saying that we have a long tradition of German angst, of German fear of nuclear power. I mean, that goes back not only to nuclear weapons, but also to the 70s and to the 80s, when the fear of nuclear accidents, but then obviously also the case of Chernobyl, have raised these kinds of fears in the German public, which are entirely different to, for example, to the French public. So the French public is very proud of the nuclear power, and they have no problem at all, and they don't have these kind of fears that Germans have about the possibility of accidents as the kind of we've seen in Chernobyl. So there's sort of this underlying dynamic. And then it was not the Greens who have decided Germany's exit from nuclear power. It was Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Christian Democrats who, after the disaster of Fukushima, decided that the costs of nuclear energy are too high, because you have to factor in not only the nuclear energy that you're producing right now, which is also subsidized to a great extent by the state, but also the costs of getting rid of the nuclear material afterwards, and of finding a place to get rid of the nuclear materials, which is a question really for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the idea was nuclear energy is not safe enough. The costs are too high of nuclear energy. And so this nuclear exit was decided at a time when the alternative to that under Angela Merkel was really Russian gas. So at the same time, the sort of Germany decided to exit nuclear energy, the only alternative which could sort of increase its contributions was Russian gas, because renewables at that time were not yet at the stage to come in. And this has all obviously been an important topic for the Green Party, which is now in power. So it was basically Angela Merkel which has driven this point home for the Green Party, but which by now the Green Party, even in the struggle against Russia, against Russia's weaponization of energy, the Green Party could not just drop and tell the electorate, well, we're actually fine with nuclear energy. So that's a point. It was the exit was postponed. Nuclear energy remained part of Germany's energy mix for the last year, but for the Green Party, it was not acceptable to continue this path. So at the moment, we are in a situation where renewables are increasing in Germany, but at the same time, Germany is relying on coal and fossil fuels, which are actually even worse for climate change. I think there is a consensus that nuclear energy is not an energy that Germany wants to rely on for decades. So the consensus is very much Germany has to shift to renewable energies. But this sudden exit from nuclear energy at a time when it really is coal that is coming in instead, which is more damaging, has to do with this long tradition of Angela Merkel kicking off the exit, and then the Greens having to continue this also to please their own domestic base.
Thank you.
June, may I ask a question? I was curious about your comments on making Germany sort of the leader militarily within Europe. And I looked up to find out how many American troops are still within Germany. And I found out that there were 35,000 American troops. And recently, towards the end of 2022, there was another 7,000 Americans sent over because of the war in Ukraine, as I understand it. At one time in the Cold War, there were 250,000 American troops in Germany. And I wondered how these American troops would sit in and fit in with your comments on Germany becoming the leader in defense of Europe.
I think the most important part in sort of this ambition of Germany, which at the moment really is an ambition, and it's a project for years, if not for a decade, until Germany can assume that role. At the moment, the most important question is here that if Germany assumes a bigger role and becomes a leader in European security, this is not meant to be on the expense of the United States. So in contrast to fears that President Macron has raised with his ideas of strategic autonomy and so on, this is not a move which is designed to reduce dependency from the US, to make Europe independent from the US. It is a move which is designed to decrease the burden on the US, but to remain firmly within the transatlantic relationship. And that's something which makes sense, because from a perspective of Poland and Central and Eastern European countries, they would never accept that to rely on their security for France and Germany. That's for them completely out of question. So what they want is a continuous US engagement in Europe. But the US has to be honest about that this is not something which can remain to the extent as we see it right now, if the US is facing a challenge coming from China. So at some point, this kind of difficult trade-offs in Europe will have to be made. And it would be much easier to say, well, look, we have actually Europeans who are able to do some smaller missions on their own without having to rely on the United States. But that doesn't mean at the same time that politically the strong bond between the United States and Europe should be loosened. So I think what we will see in the future is we will see a decrease of these US troops in Europe. And it was very clear at the beginning of the war that these troops are in Europe just to increase the deterrence effect, and that these troops are not in Europe permanently. So I don't expect these troops to stay permanently in Europe. But the question how much of this troop presence will be decreased relies very much on how much of their own deterrence efforts can European countries increase.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
How do you see the relationship between Germany and France?
Yeah, we have, that's a very interesting question, because traditionally Germany and France have been this kind of motor and engine for the European Union, right? I mean, there's a lot of positive baggage to the German-French relationship, because it was actually the example of historical reconciliation in Europe, that Germany and France are getting along and kind of pushing the European Union forwards. What we see right now is that this kind of engine, despite continuous, intergovernmental consultations and close German-French consultation, that it doesn't seem that the two governments are necessarily on the same page or trying to find common solutions to challenges. So what we see in the past is that both countries declare their own visions for Europe. So we had speeches by Macron, but then we also had speeches by Olaf Scholz in Prague, without sort of coming together on a common vision for Europe. And that's not entirely new. I mean, the German-French relationship has always been a very close relationship, but always with very different visions for Europe. But at the moment, it really feels like this engine is a little bit weaker than it has been. And it makes it more difficult to create a consensus within the European Union if the two big powers, Germany and France, are not on the same page, and especially if the other big power, Poland, which is increasingly more important in the European Union, is not on the same page with Germany and France at all. So I do think to some extent the German-French engine of the future has to become a German-French-Polish engine. But at the moment, that's a little bit just a dream, because German-Polish relations are in a very difficult state with the right-wing PiS party in Warsaw using talking points against Germany also for domestic purposes.
Liana, in this country, we talk about we're moving into a recession. Oh, no, we're not moving into back and forth day by day. In the European theater, what is the prospect of further economic turbulence, and what would the implications be on everything you've talked about for security?
Yes, I think the outlook right now is actually more optimistic than it had been, let's say, a year ago. I think a year ago, everyone was pretty certain that Europe would go into a recession, given, I mean, the moon prices for energy that we've seen. Right now, we see a kind of recovery. So inflation has gone down a little bit from really incredible heights of 2-digit inflation in Europe. We also see that Germany, as one of the big economies in Europe, is likely not entering a recession. It's not really growing to a big extent, but it's not entering a recession. So I think it's not as bad as it could have been and as some have expected. But one of the questions that we will have in the future is, if we want this Europe that is able to take its security more into its own hands, this will need fiscal support. So we need countries that, if there's a question, are also willing to increase their debt spending, to increase their defense spending and their defense efforts. And if we continue this kind of fiscal austerity that we've seen in the past, it will actually be very difficult to create the investments necessary to build up a stronger European defense industrial base and to build up stronger European basically European defense efforts.
How serious do you think the popular backlash would be to that? Building security.
Yeah, I don't really think there was a popular backlash. To the contrary, I think for the first time for European populations, the perception of a real security threat is real. So for the first time, there is the impression that Russia is a security threat, and everyone from the south to the east agrees that this security threat has to be addressed. I think the more difficult question is if you have to make trade-offs, right? I mean, if you have to cut defense, sort of other budgets, like social budgets, significantly. But there again, the question comes in, don't we need some kind of fiscal effort from the European Union to help countries build up their defense industrial base?
Yeah, I've got a question about Liana on German demographics. As we all know, Western Europe, along with lots of other developed countries, are becoming older populations. That's an obvious point. How is Germany dealing with this? I mean, it's got a low fertility rate, as many EU countries do, so the population is not obviously growing inherently. And so immigration really becomes the vehicle through which an economy can at least create some positive economic growth going forward. How is immigration being dealt with by the population? Is it an accepted fact that it's a major factor in terms of social demographics?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's actually a little bit ambiguous. So on the one hand, there's always this complaint in Germany about there not enough skilled workers. And that is very true, because what is really difficult these days is to get someone who can, to get a plumber in your house, or to get someone, with an education who can help you to build your house. So there's a lot of complaint about that. The unemployment rate is surprisingly low despite the high inflation. So we have rather a shortage of labor in Germany than we have a high unemployment rate. And on the other hand, there is this kind of difficulty to accept that Germany needs and already is an immigration country. So entirely different to the self-conception of the United States. there's still this idea that, you know, the workers that have arrived in Germany in the 50s and 60s and so on, that those were, you know, temporary workers. And there's and this sort of cultural mentality to accept, well, this is not about temporary workers, this is Germany about becoming a modern immigration country, is only slowly changing. And we've seen that with the rise of the right-wing Alternative for Germany, the right-wing party in Germany, it was really the refugee crisis in 2015 with Syrian refugees arriving in Germany that has led to a high of this party's to really a peak of the voting results. We don't see the same with Ukrainian refugees. So the Ukrainian refugees have it actually easier than Syrian refugees because they do have a work permit. So if they arrive in the European Union, they got a special exemption, which is, you know, quite unusual, that they are able to move around freely and to work. So at the moment, this kind of support for the workforce is very welcomed, and it's well, I mean, it's comparatively not easy, but it's definitely possible to find work. And we don't see this kind of, you know, right-wing populist backlash against Ukrainian refugees. But I think in the longer term, there are really a lot of challenges on Germany's path to become an immigration country and to face this kind of demographic challenge. And that starts very much with the basic language problems. I mean, immigrants are required to prove the German language skills, which certainly makes sense, but to some extent, there's also a big problem that Germany is just not the kind of broadly English-speaking country that one would need, especially in the administration. So if you go to any of Germany's administration, for instance, to get your passport stamped and so on, it's actually not that easy to get to a person who speaks English. So that's a barrier in itself, which is sort of entirely different in the UK, for instance, where and then the other barrier sort of in the long term to becoming this kind of immigration country is also the procedure of getting a work permit for Germany. So it's always been this idea to model the kind of green card concept that the US has, but at the moment it's still a lot of paperwork to get a work permit for Germany, and especially a lot of paperwork in German, which really scares many away.
Liana, would I be correct that in part Ukrainian and German culture is much closer than Syrian and German culture on top of the language issue?
I think that can be one explanation. I mean, the other explanation is that, you know, this kind of other wing of Syrian refugees, because they're Muslims, you know, potential racist undertones there, which we've also seen towards the Turkish community that has come to Germany. So I would say it's not only a question about culture, it's also a question about basic openness in a society.
Differences.
And exactly, and accepting differences. I think it's for Ukrainians, it's relatively easy to come to Poland because Poland has really been a very welcoming state, and it's sort of culturally also close to Ukrainian. But also in Germany, it's, I mean, you're right, it's not entirely far away, but I would not say that this is the only reason for this kind of at least sort of after the initial welcome of Syrian refugees, for this kind of discussion about whether they fit into German society or not.
I was trying to follow through with some of your comments on China to switch to that part of the world. And from what I understand, that Germany had very little interest and investment in Russia as compared to its investments in China. And so one of the differences is probably that the German investment in China is so great that it influences the government of Germany's ability to look sideways at how to deal with China. And I wondered what else was if that is true, what can Germany do to compensate for that big difference?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's so it's the dependence on China, but it's also sort of a more in-depth hope that we will not end up in this kind of new Cold War with China. The Cold War for Germany has really been, an entirely traumatic experience, the division of the country. There's nothing which, winks in any way positive in Germany about the Cold War. And so there's this hope that this kind of bipolarity that we might see with China having Russia, Iran, and others on its side, and parts of the global south, and the US and the West on the other side, and the broader global West, is something that can be prevented, that we will have a world of multipolarity where Europe will also play a role. And into that, it certainly plays into that China is hoped to become a constructive actor in the war in Ukraine. A hope which one has to be very careful with, because so far China has positioned itself clearly at Russia's side. It has tried to portray itself as a peacemaker. Ukraine puts some of its bets on China as a country that can influence Russia. But I think especially Europeans have to be very cautious not to sort of grasp the first offer that they get from China, but really to stay clear in their analysis that what China is doing is not for global peace. It's not some kind of neutral positioning, but China very much understands that it's China's opportunity now to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States if they're able to convince Europeans that they are a constructive actor, and are able to convince Europeans that the kind of competition that is going on is driven by the United States and not by China, and that China is sort of the sheep in that relationship and not the wolf. And I think we have to keep this dynamic in mind, and especially Europeans who, once they get a cooperation offer, very quickly to go into that trap and to accept the cooperation offers need to keep a very clear-eyed view about China and its role in Ukraine and globally.
I'm now curious as to how you are taking that wonderful view of yours into the world. I mean, what are your relations with Germany at the moment, in the sense of how you can influence what they're thinking? Could I ask you that question?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm in constant touch with German counterparts, with colleagues in Germany, with politicians, with administration officials. So that's definitely something that it's a message that definitely many people who observe China are trying to get home.
I see. Thank you. Yeah. Peter, where are you? You haven't asked your question.
I've got kind of a socio-economic question, I guess you'd call it. The differences between, in terms of GDP, gross domestic product per capita, between the East and the West are still quite noticeable. So if you're looking at Saxony or Mecklenburg and places like that, states like that, the GDP per capita is significantly lower than it is around Frankfurt or Hamburg and so forth. Is anything being constructively done to kind of offset that imbalance? And does that imbalance kind of create a malaise between the East and the West? I mean, I don't want to make too much of it, but is there still a feeling perhaps of a little bit of resentment by East Germans vis-a-vis West Germans?
Yeah, it's interesting that this still is a question so many years after unification. You're very right that it is not only a question of economic welfare, which is different between the East and West, it's also a question of cultural differences. So what we've seen is that, especially in East Germany, those people who stayed in East Germany and likely under worse economic conditions than they had in the past do have this kind of resentment against West Germany, against West German politicians. Those who are young and sort of looking for opportunities have mostly moved out of East Germany and have tried to sort of make the living in other parts. Politically, there has been an attempt to create kind of centers of excellence in East Germany, and especially in the university cities, to really bring companies back to East Germany and to sort of, ignite the kind of economic growth that would help East Germany. We've seen a lot of cities in East Germany, which have been renovated, which really, are lovely tourist destinations these days. But even that has led to some kind of, sometimes dissatisfaction. Why are these kind of renovations not taking place in West German cities, which are also partly suffering from economic decline? So there are these difficulties. And again, the most interesting difference there perhaps is how this is reflected in foreign policy views. And what we see is that East Germans constantly, for instance, on the question of weapon deliveries for Ukraine, are constantly more reluctant when it comes to weapon deliveries. They're constantly more understanding of Russian arguments and positions. I mean, that's a generalization to make, but in some opinion polls, we can see that difference. And that certainly has to do something with the cultural background, the thankfulness for Gorbachev that he allowed the German unification, but this kind of change in the mental map that, the times of Gorbachev are really over and we are back in the dark times with Russia. It's something which is difficult to accept. And I think it's not only the social economic grounds, it's also sort of the cultural narratives, which in East Germany are sometimes different than in West Germany.
Yeah, in that regard, you may have seen an article, I think it was about a week ago in perhaps the Wall Street Journal, I'm not sure, but pointing out that there are thousands of monuments and statues in Eastern Germany that are still there glorifying Russian troops and the fact that they came to defeat the Nazis back in World War II, and the extreme hesitancy to take them down, to, eliminate them, as so many monuments have in other parts of the world, probably when the political emphasis is elsewhere. So it's just very interesting. And apparently you have to really make a major legislative request or demand locally in whatever your town or state is that these monuments be taken down. And the hesitancy is very noticeable.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very broad consensus that these are sort of statues of remembrance for the victims that the Soviet Union had, remembrance for the contribution that the Soviet Union made in the victory over Nazi Germany, which was very much one of the founding principles of the GDR back then. And I think Germany is sort of, given its past, it is certainly difficult to find a way to look at Russia's and the Soviet Union's contributions in the war against fascism in a way which sort of updates the old thinking. And I mean, an update to the old thinking would, for instance, include to think about these monuments and the role that the Soviet Union played as a role that not only Russia played, but that is a role where Ukrainians and Belarusians and other people of the Soviet Union actually had suffered the greatest numbers of victims in this war. And it also needs an update in terms of reflecting how, despite these sacrifices, the Stalinist regime at the time was really a regime which, deported so many of its own citizens, which was so cruelly internally. So I think all the kind of complexity that surrounded the Soviet Union's role in the victory over fascism is something which is sort of coming up right now, but which for a very long time has just been reduced to this German-Russian reconciliation dimension, which interestingly really only focused on Russia and not on any other countries from the former Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So
I was curious, how is Olaf Scholz doing in the polling internally in Germany now? Is he
I mean,
improving or things stable, totally stable?
I think as every politician at that point, he's sort of struggling to get high approval ratings. Who is getting high approval ratings is the new German defense minister. And I think it's worth looking out for him, Oscar Pistorius. He is someone who is a long-term member of the Social Democratic Party, but who really tries right now to reform the Ministry of Defense and the German Bundeswehr in a way that can really tackle the challenges. And he suddenly rose to the very top of the popularity scala, which sometimes others are happy that they don't have this position because it's something where you can only go down from, right, once you've reached this position. So that's something, I think the popularity rankings can still change until the next German elections in 2025, but it's interesting to observe that it's now the defense minister who's so popular.
You know, going back to you're talking about sort of the divisions between the East and West. Are there people also from the West who are going to the East? I mean, how strong is sort of the migration one way versus the migration the other way?
Yeah, and that's probably the last question I can take before I have to head out.
Thank
And it was a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks so much for your time. We do have this kind of movement, especially to those places in East Germany that have become this kind of center of excellences, you know, where you have industry coming in and so on, but very much focused on, you know, cities, and very much focused on the big cities in East Germany, where it is especially the countryside that is really suffering from people moving away from the East German countryside. So we do see some movements to the big cities, to the university cities, but really the countryside is the problem there.
Liana, great to have you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you. I wish you
Thank
all a
you.
wonderful day, and thanks for
No.
having me.
I
Yeah,
hope to
thank
see
you.
you again.
Thanks very much.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you. And, you know, giving us a much deeper understanding of really what's happening in Europe through the eyes of Germany. So
Thanks so much.
thank you.
Bye bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.
Thank
So
you.
before, you know, we close, I want to remind you that this is our last meeting. And we look forward to seeing you next fall. We do have a date that we will be starting the program, and that is going to be on Monday, September 18th, with Kenneth Roth, who is the former executive director of the Human Rights Watch. He is now a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Carr Center for Human Rights, and will be a visiting professor at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. So but have a wonderful summer, and we will see you then.